The whispers followed her like graveyard mist, cold and clinging. For Lady Eleanor Vance, the glittering ballroom of Lancaster House wasn't a place of dreams. It was the stage for her public execution. Her engagement to the handsome Viscount Ashworth was overshadowed in front of the very society that had once envied her. They called her plain dull, a forgotten relic, before she had even truly lived. Laughter echoed behind gloved hands as she became London's latest cautionary tale. She was ruined. Finished, until the ballroom doors swung open and a silence fell colder than any whisper. Through the parted sea of gawking aristocrats walked the one man no one dared to mock. Duke Alistair Beaumont of Blackwood, a man forged in shadow, whose fortune was as vast as his reputation, was ruthless, and he was walking directly towards her. The chandeliers of Lancaster House dripped crystal light, casting a merciless glare upon the wreckage of Lady Eleanor Vance's life. It had happened less than an hour ago, yet the memory was already seared into her soul, a brand of public shame. It wasn't a quiet, dignified dissolution of a betrothal. Lord Richard Ashworth, a man whose profile was as celebrated as his morals were suspect, had made it a spectacle. He had cornered her near the grand staircase, his voice just loud enough for the circling vultures of the ton to hear. "My dear Eleanor," he'd begun his smile, a cruel slash of white in his perfectly handsome face. "A man of my ambitions requires a wife who is a diamond of the first water, a partner who can dazzle. You are a perfectly serviceable stone, but alas, not a diamond." The words were a physical blow. Standing beside him, preening like a prize peacock, was Lady Beatrice Croft. Her hair was the colour of spun gold, her laughter like tinkling bells, and her dowry, it was whispered, could refloat the entire Royal Navy. She hadn't even bothered to hide her triumphant smirk. The surrounding crowd had frozen a tableau of feigned shock and ravenous delight. The whispers started instantly spreading like a contagion. "Plain as a post," someone murmured. "Her father, Baron Vance, is nearly destitute," hissed another. "Ashworth was always aiming higher. Poor girl never stood a chance." Eleanor had stood there, her spine ramrod straight, the blood draining from her face. She refused to give them the satisfaction of tears. She had simply looked Richard in the eye, her own gaze clear and steady. "I see," she had said, her voice a low, controlled tremor. "Then I release you, my lord. May you find a diamond whose facets are sharp enough to match your own." With that, she had turned and walked away, each step an agony. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes boring into her back, dissecting her, pitying her, and worst of all, laughing at her. Her dress, a simple gown of pale blue silk that she had thought elegant, now felt like a pauper's sackcloth. She was 20 years old, and her life in society was over. Her father, Baron Vance, a kind man worn down by financial hardship, and the ghost of his late wife, found her in a quiet alcove. His face was a mask of weary sorrow. "Eleanor, I am so sorry. That cur, it is not your fault, father," she whispered finally, allowing a single tear to trace a path down her cheek. "It is mine for believing a wolf could ever be a lamb." They were preparing to make their escape, a quiet retreat into the social exile that now awaited them, when the atmosphere in the ballroom underwent a seismic shift. The ceaseless chatter and light music didn't just quieten, it was extinguished as if a sudden frost had descended. The towering doors to the ballroom had opened, and framed within them was a figure who commanded attention, not through charm, but through sheer unadulterated power. Duke Alistair Beaumont of Blackwood. He was a man who existed more in legend than in London society. He was fabulously, almost mythically wealthy, having built a commercial empire of shipping and industry upon the foundations of his ancient title. But he was also known to be cold, ruthless, and utterly contemptuous of the frivolous games of the aristocracy. His dark hair was unstyled, his jaw was square and uncompromising, and his eyes, a startling, piercing grey, missed nothing. They swept the room with an unnerving intensity, as if he were calculating the worth of every soul present and finding them all wanting. He never attended such events. His presence was so rare, so shocking, that it was akin to a hawk appearing in a canary's cage. Every head turned. Every fan stopped fluttering. Even Richard Ashworth and Beatrice Croft, holding court in their moment of triumph, fell silent, their expressions turning from smug to unnerved. The Duke ignored them all. His gaze swept the room once, twice, and then with an unnerving precision, it landed on Eleanor. She froze, feeling pinned by his stare like a moth to a collector's board. For a long, breathless moment, the most powerful man in England simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he began to move. He didn't saunter or stroll. He cut a path through the gawking crowd as if they were nothing more than overgrown weeds. The lords and ladies practically stumbled over themselves to get out of his way. He passed Ashworth without a flicker of recognition, his focus solely on the alcove where Eleanor stood with her father. He stopped before them. He was taller than she'd imagined his presence, an intimidating wall of dark broadcloth and palpable will. He addressed her father, though his eyes never left Eleanor's. "Baron Vance." He said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no warmth, only authority. "I am Alistair Beaumont." The Baron, flustered, could only manage a choked, "Your Grace, we were just leaving." "That will not be necessary," the Duke stated. It was not a suggestion. His gaze finally shifted fully to Eleanor, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than ice in their depths. It wasn't kindness. It was appraisal. "Lady Eleanor, I believe you find yourself without a fiancé." The bluntness of it stole her breath. She could feel the heat of 100 stares. She lifted her chin. "Your Grace, I am well aware of my circumstances." A corner of his mouth ticked upwards, a minute motion that could not be called a smile. "Good," he said. "Then you will not be surprised by a new proposition." He turned back to her stunned father. "Baron, with your permission, I would like to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Richard Ashworth's jaw dropped, his face paling to a sickly white. Beatrice Croft looked as if she'd been slapped. Baron Vance stared speechless, looking from the formidable Duke to his daughter, his mind unable to process the words. Eleanor felt a strange, dizzying sensation, as if the world had tilted on its axis. The man who disdained society, the ruthless industrialist, the cold Duke of Blackwood, wanted to marry her, the plain, ruined, penniless daughter of a minor baron. It made no sense. It was impossible. It was a dream, or more likely a nightmare. "Your Grace," her father finally stammered, I don't understand." The Duke's grey eyes were back on Eleanor, and this time they held a glint of something that looked dangerously like a challenge. "It is quite simple, Baron," he said, his voice carrying easily through the tomb-like silence of the room. "Lord Ashworth seeks a diamond. He is a fool. He does not understand that diamonds are merely compressed carbon. Brittle. Common." His gaze held hers intense and unwavering. "I, on the other hand, am in search of something far rarer. I am in search of steel." The ride back to Vance's house, in the Duke of Blackwood's carriage, was a masterclass in suffocating silence. The vehicle itself was a statement of power. Dark, lacquered wood perfectly sprung the interior, lined with supple black leather that smelled of wealth and masculine authority. It was a world away from their own rickety carriage, currently following behind like a loyal, shabby dog. Her father sat opposite them, still looking as if he'd been struck by lightning. He kept opening his mouth to speak, then closing it again, utterly intimidated by the man beside Eleanor. Duke Alistair Beaumont didn't speak. He simply sat a formidable presence, looking out the window at the gas-lit streets of London, as if he owned every cobblestone. Eleanor, seated on the plush squabs, felt a maelstrom of emotions, confusion, fear, and a tiny defiant spark of anger. He had made her the centre of a far greater spectacle than the one Ashworth had orchestrated. He had saved her from one fire, only to toss her into another one, whose flames felt infinitely hotter and more dangerous. When they finally arrived at the modest but respectable Vance house in Bloomsbury, the Duke escorted them to the door. "I will call upon you tomorrow morning, Baron," he announced, "at 10. We will discuss the particulars." With a curt nod, he was gone, disappearing into the London night as abruptly as he had appeared. The moment the door closed, Baron Vance sank into a worn armchair. "Eleanor, what just happened?" "I have no more idea than you, Father," she replied, her mind racing. "It makes no sense. The man is a duke. He could have any woman in England. Why me?" He spoke of Steele. Her father murmured, a thoughtful look replacing his shock. "When Ashworth insulted you, you did not cry. You did not faint. You met his gaze and you cut him down with a single sentence." Perhaps the Duke saw that. He saw a public spectacle, Eleanor countered, pacing the worn Aubusson carpet. He saw an opportunity. But for what? To mock the ton. To show he can pick up what another man casts aside and turn it into a prize. "I will not be a pawn in his games, Father." "A pawn," her father said, his voice gaining a desperate edge. "Eleanor, this is not a game. This is a miracle. Do you know what this means? Our debts could be settled. Your future, which an hour ago was a barren wasteland, is now. It is secured by the most powerful man in the kingdom." Her heart ached at his words. She knew the weight he carried, the failing estate, the mounting bills, the constant worry that had etched deep lines into his face. For him, the Duke was not a man, but a solution, a lifeline. The next morning, the Duke arrived at precisely 10 o'clock. He was not dressed for a social call, but for business in a perfectly tailored dark coat and trousers that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders. He accepted a cup of tea, but didn't drink it, his grey eyes scanning their modest parlour, taking in the faded curtains and threadbare furniture with an unnerving lack of judgment. It was simply data to him. "Baron," he began, getting straight to the point. "Let us speak plainly. I wish to marry your daughter. In return, I will settle all your outstanding debts immediately. Furthermore, I will provide you with an annuity of £5,000 per annum for the remainder of your life. Your estate Vancewood will be restored to its former prosperity under my management." Baron Vance paled at the sum. It was more money than he had seen in his entire life. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes pleading. But Eleanor would not be sold like a prize filly. "And what does my daughter get?" "Your Grace?" she asked, her voice cool and steady, cutting through her father's awe. "Besides the dubious honour of your name?" The Duke turned his full attention to her. The air crackled with a new tension. He seemed not offended, but intrigued. "She gets my protection. She gets a household second to none in England. She gets a fortune that will ensure she never wants for anything ever again. She will be a duchess. I would have thought that sufficient." "You speak of possessions, Your Grace, not of a marriage." Eleanor pressed her hands clasped in her lap to stop them from trembling. Will this be a true marriage, or am I to be a decorative fixture in one of your many houses brought out for display when required? For the first time, a genuine, albeit faint, smile touched Alistair Beaumont's lips. It transformed his harsh features, hinting at a man long buried beneath layers of iron control. You are not the decorative type, Lady Eleanor. I am aware of that. No, this will be a true marriage, in name and in law. I require an heir, a son to carry the Beaumont name and inherit my empire. He paused, his gaze unflinching. I expect you to perform your duties in that regard. Beyond that, your time is your own. You may pursue your interests, manage the household as you see fit, or read in the library until you go blind. I am not a man who requires constant companionship. I require loyalty, discretion, and a son. In return, you will have security and freedom. It is a business arrangement. I believe the terms are quite favorable. Brutal, honest, devoid of a single shred of romance. It was a devil's bargain laid bare on the table. He wasn't offering her his heart. He was offering her a contract. She thought of her father's relief. She thought of the sneering faces of Beatrice Croft and Richard Ashworth, and the delicious, unthinkable shock they must be experiencing. And she thought of the alternative, a life of quiet poverty and spinsterhood forever marked by the shame of her broken engagement. This man, this cold, calculating duke, was offering her a different kind of cage, a gilded one to be sure, but one that came with power, a cage from which she could perhaps look down upon those who had once mocked her. She took a deep breath. I have terms of my own, Your Grace. Her father gasped, but the Duke merely inclined his head, a gesture of permission. First, she said, my father will not simply be given an annuity. He will be named a paid consultant in the management of the Vancewood estate. His dignity is not for sale. The Duke's eyebrow rose slightly. Acceptable. Second, my personal passion is architectural history and botany. The library at your primary residence, Blackwood Manor, is said to be one of the finest in private hands. I will require unrestricted access to it and to all family archives. Granted, he said, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Third, she continued, her voice gaining strength, you say you require loyalty and discretion. You shall have it. But it is a two-way street. I will not be your wife in public and a stranger in private. I expect your respect. I will not be ignored or dismissed. If we are to be partners in this enterprise, then we shall be true partners. You will speak to me of your business, your ambitions, your enemies. I will not be kept in the dark. This gave him pause. He studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes seeming to peer right through her, weighing and measuring her resolve. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Her father held his breath. Finally the Duke nodded slowly. A true partner, he mused as if tasting the words. A very interesting proposition, Lady Eleanor. Very well, I accept your terms. He stood the deal concluded as swiftly and unsentimentally as one of his shipping contracts. The engagement will be announced in the Times tomorrow. The wedding will be in 1 month's time. Be ready. As he left, Eleanor felt a tremor of fear, but also a surge of exhilaration. She had just negotiated her own future with the most formidable man in England. She had not been a damsel, but a bargainer. She had met steel with steel. And as she looked out the window at his retreating carriage, she knew one thing for certain. Her life, as the plain, forgotten Eleanor Vance, was over. A new, far more dangerous and unpredictable chapter was about to begin. The chapter of the Duchess of Blackwood. The wedding was an affair of breathtaking opulence and chilling impersonality. It took place at St. George's, Hanover Square, the church packed with every peer of the realm, all of them drawn by the sheer morbid curiosity of the union. Eleanor walked the aisle on her father's arm, a vision in ivory satin and antique lace, a gown commissioned by the Duke's man of business, perfect in every detail. She felt like an actress playing a part. She saw Richard Ashworth in the pews, his face a thunderous mask of jealousy and disbelief. Beatrice Croft stood beside him, her beautiful features twisted into a venomous scowl. Seeing them, Eleanor felt a cold surge of satisfaction that momentarily eclipsed her fear. She had won, though she wasn't entirely sure what the prize was. Her groom waited at the altar. Alistair Beaumont was impassive, his gaze fixed on her as she approached. When she reached him, he took her hand. His touch was cool and firm, not a lover's caress, but the sealing of a contract. He spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, and she spoke hers in return. When he slid the wedding band onto her finger, a heavy band of Welsh gold, simple and unadorned, it felt less like a symbol of love and more like a manacle. The reception was held at his London residence, Beaumont House, a veritable palace on Piccadilly, but they did not linger. Before the festivities had even peaked, the Duke spirited her away. They were to travel immediately to his ancestral seat and primary residence, Blackwood Manor, in the heart of Northumberland. The journey north was long, the landscape growing wilder and more dramatic with each passing mile. The Duke was a quiet companion, reading business ledgers for much of the trip. He was not unkind, but he was distant, a man encased in a fortress of his own making. They arrived at Blackwood as dusk was bleeding across the sky in hues of purple and bruised orange. The manor was not a house. It was a Gothic masterpiece of grey stone turrets and crenellations rising from the rugged landscape like a dragon's tooth. It was magnificent, imposing, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was a perfect reflection of its master. The household staff lined the cavernous entry hall, led by a severe, rail-thin housekeeper named Mrs. Finch, and a stoic, silver-haired butler named Jennings. They greeted their new Duchess with disciplined respect, but Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, measuring her, wondering what sort of woman their forbidding master had brought home. "Mrs. Finch will show you to your chambers," Alistair said, his voice echoing in the stone hall. "We will dine at 8. Jennings will show you the way to the dining room." He then turned and strode down a long corridor, without a backward glance, disappearing into the shadows of his own home. Eleanor was led up a grand, sweeping staircase to the Duchess's suite. It was a series of rooms larger than her entire London house, decorated in rich but sombre tones of deep blue and silver. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill that seemed to seep from the very stones. It was luxurious, but it felt profoundly lonely. The first few weeks at Blackwood were a study in solitude. The Duke was a creature of routine and work. He rose before dawn, spent his days locked in his study with his secretaries, and often worked late into the night. They shared their meals in a dining hall so vast that her voice seemed to get lost on its way across the long, polished table. Their conversations were polite, formal, and centered on household matters or neutral topics. He would ask if she was comfortable, if she had everything she needed. She would inquire about his day, and he would give a brief, uninformative reply about progress on the shipping manifests or a dispute at the coal mine. He was upholding his end of the bargain. He gave her complete freedom. But he gave her nothing of himself. The marriage bed was a place of quiet, efficient duty, a transaction aimed at producing the required heir. There was no tenderness, no passion, only a shared, silent purpose. In the darkness, she could sometimes feel the tension in him, a tightly coiled spring of some emotion she couldn't name, but by morning, The iron mask was always back in place. True to her own terms, Eleanor did not languish. She took her role as Duchess seriously, meeting with Mrs. Finch to understand the intricate workings of the massive household. She was fair but firm, earning the staff's quiet respect. But her true solace was the library. It was her sanctuary, a 2-story cathedral of books with soaring arched windows that looked out over the wild, windswept moors. It was even more magnificent than the rumors had suggested. She spent hours there, losing herself in ancient texts, studying the architectural plans of the manor itself, and reading her beloved books on botany. It was in the library that she began to piece together the history of the Beaumonts. She found portraits of Alistair's parents, the 8th Duke, and his beautiful, sad-eyed wife. They had both died in a tragic carriage accident when Alistair was only 19, leaving him to inherit not just a title, but a near-bankrupt estate. It was Alistair himself who had rebuilt the family fortune, not through land, but through ruthless, brilliant forays into modern industry. This explained his drive, his work ethic, but not his coldness. One rainy afternoon, exploring a dusty, forgotten corner of the library, she found a collection of journals bound in faded blue leather. They were written in a delicate feminine hand. They belonged to Alistair's mother, the late Duchess. Hesitantly, she opened one. The early entries were full of love and hope, speaking of her handsome husband and her beautiful baby boy Alistair. But as the years passed, the tone grew darker, more desperate. She wrote of her husband's gambling, of his disastrous investments, of friends who took advantage of him. She mentioned one name repeatedly, a man she described as a smiling viper, a friend who is our ruin. Lord Byron Ashworth, the father of Richard Ashworth. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The journal detailed how Ashworth Sr. had led her husband into a series of ruinous financial schemes, all while secretly buying up his debts. The Beaumonts were on the verge of losing everything, including Blackwood itself, to the Ashworths. The final entry was dated the day before the carriage accident. Alistair knows she had written, "My poor, serious boy. He sees the ruin his father has wrought. He carries a weight no 19-year-old should ever have to bear. I fear what this knowledge will turn him into." Suddenly so much became clear. This wasn't just about business or disdain for society. It was about a deep generational wound. Alistair's coldness wasn't just his nature. It was armor forged in the fires of betrayal and loss. And his marriage to her, the woman Richard Ashworth had so publicly cast aside. It was not a random act. It was a calculated move in a much older, much deadlier game. Later that evening, as they sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, Eleanor looked at her husband with new eyes. She saw not just the ruthless Duke, but the 19-year-old boy who had inherited a legacy of ruin and had single-handedly clawed his way back to the top. "I spent the day in the library," she said, her voice soft. "I was reading about the history of the estate." Alistair looked up from his plate, his expression guarded. "And what did you find?" "I found that you are a far more remarkable man than anyone in London gives you credit for," she said simply. He didn't reply, but his fork stilled in his hand. For a fleeting second, the armor cracked. She saw a flicker of surprise, of vulnerability in his grey eyes before the mask slammed back into place. He gave a curt nod. The estate archives are extensive. The conversation was over. But for Eleanor, something had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer just a party to a business transaction. She was the keeper of his family's secrets, the unwitting chess piece in a war of revenge. And a strange protective feeling began to bloom in her heart for the cold, broken man who was her husband. Life at Blackwood continued its measured, quiet rhythm, but Eleanor now moved through her days with a new sense of purpose. Her discovery of the Duchess's journals had recontextualized everything. Her husband was not a monster. He was a soldier in a war no one else knew he was fighting. She began to watch him, not as a wife watching a husband, but as an archivist studying a complex, fascinating subject. She noticed the small things, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was poring over a difficult ledger, the brief, almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when he looked at the portrait of his mother that hung in the long gallery, the way he would sometimes stand at the library window, gazing out at the moors, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. She decided to make her own move, not on his heart, but on his world. She began to use her knowledge. During one of their stilted dinners, he mentioned a problem with a new railway line he was planning. A local landowner, a Sir Gideon Croft Beatrice's uncle, she noted with interest, was refusing to sell a crucial parcel of land, demanding an exorbitant price and blocking the entire project. "He claims the land is worthless bog," Alistair said, a muscle tightening in his jaw, "but he knows its position is vital. The man is a greedy fool." "Is it the parcel known as Tanglewood Fen?" Eleanor asked casually. Alistair looked up surprised. "Yes." "How would you know that?" "I've been studying the estate maps from the late 18th century, she replied, carefully keeping her tone academic. "According to the botanical surveys done by your great-grandfather, Tanglewood Fen isn't a bog. The soil composition is unique. It contains a significant deposit of marl clay." He stared at her, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Marl clay?" "Yes." She continued, warming to her subject. "It's an excellent fertilizer for acidic soil, and more importantly, it's a key component in the production of high-quality bricks. The very bricks used to build the west wing of this manor, in fact. If Sir Gideon knew what was under his feet, he wouldn't be asking for a fortune. He'd be starting his own brickworks. As it stands, he is trying to sell you a gold mine for the price of a muddy field without even knowing it contains gold." Alistair slowly put his fork down. The look on his face was one of profound, unadulterated shock. He was not looking at the plain girl from the ballroom or the signatory to his contract. He was looking at an asset, an equal. "Show me," he commanded. For the next 2 hours, the great dining table was cleared of food and covered with dusty maps and geological surveys from the library. Eleanor, her initial nervousness fading into intellectual excitement, pointed out the relevant passages, explaining the science, with a clarity and passion he had never seen in her. He listened intently, asking sharp, intelligent questions. For the first time, they were not Duke and Duchess, but two minds working in concert, a partnership. The next day, Alistair dispatched his agent with a new offer to Sir Gideon Croft, one that was still generous, but far below the landowner's extortionate demands, and came with a clause that all mineral rights would belong to the Duke. Sir Gideon, ignorant of the land's true value, scoffed, but eventually accepted, believing he had still gotten the better of the Duke. Alistair had secured his railway path and a valuable clay deposit for a fraction of its worth. That evening at dinner, the atmosphere was different. The silence was less heavy, more comfortable. "Your discovery," Alistair said, "breaking the quiet, has saved me upwards of £50,000 and months of legal wrangling. I am pleased my studies proved useful," Eleanor replied demurely, though her heart swelled with pride. "Useful." He gave a short, sharp laugh. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh. The sound was rusty, but real. "Eleanor, what you did was brilliant. Why did you never speak of this? This expertise? No one ever asked," she said simply. His gaze on her was long and thoughtful. He saw her then, truly saw her perhaps for the first time. He saw the keen intellect, the quiet confidence, the hidden depths, that the glittering, superficial world of the tun had completely overlooked. The serviceable stone was revealing facets he had never anticipated. A subtle shift began. He started seeking her out. He would appear in the library in the late afternoon, not to read his ledgers, but to ask her opinion on a new architectural plan for a warehouse, or to listen to her theories on crop rotation for the estate's farms. He began to talk to her about his empire, not just the successes, but the struggles, the rivals, the relentless pressure. He was confiding in her. One evening they were walking on the battlements, the wind whipping her cloak around her. The rugged landscape of the moors stretched out below them, bathed in the soft light of a rising moon. "I never brought anyone here," he said suddenly, his voice low against the wind. "Not from London. They would not understand this place. They see it as empty, barren." "I see it as resilient," Eleanor said, looking out at the stark beauty. "It endures. It has a strength that a manicured garden could never possess." He turned to look at her, his profile carved against the twilight sky. "Like you," he said softly. The words hung in the air between them, intimate and unexpected. Her breath caught in her throat. He took a step closer, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. His thumb brushed against her skin, a touch that was hesitant questioning. It was a world away from the perfunctory intimacy of their marriage bed. This was different. This was real. "Eleanor." He began, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. But before he could continue, the sound of an approaching carriage rattled in the courtyard below. A moment later, Jennings appeared on the battlements, his face grim. "Your Grace," the butler said, his voice tight, "you have a visitor. It is Lord Richard Ashworth." The moment shattered. The warmth vanished, replaced by an arctic chill. Alistair dropped his hand, his face hardening back into the granite mask she knew so well. The fortress walls slammed back into place. "He would not have come all this way without a reason," Alistair said, his voice cold as steel. "He is here to do damage." He turned to Eleanor, his eyes dark with a warning. "Stay in your rooms. I will deal with this." As he strode away, every inch, the ruthless Duke of Blackwood, once more Eleanor felt a profound sense of loss for the man who had stood beside her just moments before. And she felt a cold dread. Ashworth's arrival was not a social call. It was an act of war. Lord Ashworth was not alone. As Eleanor watched from the shadows of the upper gallery, she saw that Beatrice Croft had accompanied him. She stood beside Richard in the grand hall, looking about with a proprietary air, as if she were already measuring the place for new curtains. They were a matched set of gilded serpents brought to Blackwood to spread their venom. Alistair met them at the foot of the stairs, his face an impassive mask, his entire being radiating cold fury. "Ashworth," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "you are a very long way from your usual hunting grounds. To what do I owe this unwelcome intrusion?" "Your Grace." Richard began with a slick smile, though his eyes betrayed his nervousness. "Beatrice and I were touring the north. We couldn't possibly be so close without paying our respects to you and your new Duchess." The way he said "new Duchess" was a calculated insult. "My wife is not receiving visitors," Alistair stated flatly. "State your business and be gone." Beatrice stepped forward, her smile as sweet as poison. "Oh, but our business concerns her directly. You see, we've come out of a sense of duty. We are worried for you, Your Grace. You were so hasty in your marriage. We fear you do not know the truth about the Vances." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. She remained hidden, knowing Alistair had ordered her to stay away, but she could not abandon him to face this alone. Alistair didn't move. Enlighten me. Richard took a step forward, his confidence growing. The Baron, her father, is a desperate man. His debts are the talk of London, and desperation, as we know, leads to deception. Are you certain your marriage wasn't a carefully laid trap, a scheme by a bankrupt baron to ensnare the wealthiest duke in England, using his plain spinster daughter as bait? Alistair's silence was more menacing than any roar. Are you finished? Not quite, Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. We have heard whispers that Lady Eleanor was not as innocent as she appeared, that her desperation for a husband was so great she might have compromised herself to secure one. She let the vile insinuation hang in the air. It was a lie, a disgusting, baseless fabrication designed to plant a seed of doubt to tarnish Eleanor in Alistair's eyes and make him question the very foundation of their union. They were trying to destroy the fragile trust that had just begun to grow between them. From her vantage point, Eleanor watched Alistair's face. It was unreadable. She felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. Their marriage was a contract. What if he believed them? What if he saw her as a fraud, a co-conspirator in a sordid scheme? Alistair was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Then he spoke, his voice so quiet it was terrifying. "Jennings." "Your Grace," the butler replied, stepping from the shadows. "Have Lord Ashworth and Lady Croft's carriage brought back around. They are leaving." Richard's face flushed with anger. "You can't just dismiss us. We came with a warning." "You came with slander." Alistair corrected him, taking a single deliberate step forward. The sheer menace in his presence made both Richard and Beatrice flinch. "You come into my home, you insult my wife, and you dare to call it a warning. Let me give you one in return. The mines and factories I own are fueled by coal and iron. But my empire is built on information. I know about your father's near-treasonous dealings during the Napoleonic Wars, Lady Croft. And Ashworth. I know every gambling debt you have, every shady investment you've made. I know that you are one bad turn of a card away from total ruin." Richard went pale. Beatrice looked utterly stunned. "Your campaign against my wife is over." Alistair continued, his voice a blade of ice. "If I hear one more whisper against her name, if you so much as breathe in her direction again, I will not simply ruin you. I will erase you. Your names will be erased from every ledger, every club book, and every drawing room in London. You will cease to exist. Do you understand me?" They were speechless, their malicious plans crumbling in the face of his raw, absolute power. They nodded dumbly. "Good," Alistair said. "Now get out of my house." He turned his back on them, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. Jennings escorted the two stunned vipers out into the night. Eleanor remained in the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had defended her, not as a possession, but as his wife. He had called her my wife, with a ferocity that had shaken the very stones of the hall. After a few minutes, she crept down the stairs. Alistair was standing in front of the massive fireplace, one hand braced against the mantelpiece, staring into the flames. He looked exhausted, the fight having taken a toll she hadn't expected. "Alistair," she said softly. He turned, and his eyes were dark with a turbulent emotion. "I told you to stay in your rooms." "I couldn't," she whispered. "Thank you." "They are vermin," he growled. "They tried to use the same tactics on me that they used on you, lies and insinuation. They believe everyone is as shallow and gullible as they are." She took a hesitant step towards him. "You did not for a moment believe them?" He looked at her as if she were mad. "Believe them, Eleanor, I knew of your father's debts before I ever proposed to you." It was a factor in my calculations. I knew he was desperate. That is why the offer had to be overwhelming. He paused, his expression shifting. As for the other, the insinuation against your honor, the idea is laughable. I chose you precisely because you are not like them. You have integrity. It is the first thing I noticed about you standing there on that staircase after Ashworth had tried to break you. You didn't break. The simple, unadorned statement was more precious to her than any flowery poetry. He had seen the truth of her from the very beginning. The journals, she confessed, her voice barely audible. Your mother's journals. I found them. I know about Ashworth's father. I know what he did to your family. Alistair went very still. The air grew thick with unspoken history. Then you understand, he finally said, his voice raw. You understand that my marriage to you was not just a whim. It was the first move in your revenge, she finished for him, taking the woman his son had discarded and making her the Duchess of Blackwood. It was the ultimate humiliation. It was a piece of it, yes. He admitted, his gaze locked on hers. It was meant to be a cold, calculated strike against an old enemy, a way to reclaim a piece of what their family had tried to steal from mine. He took a step towards her, closing the distance between them. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. But it is not a cold calculation any longer, Eleanor. Somewhere along the way, the pawn became the queen. His grey eyes, so often stormy and guarded, were clear and filled with an intensity that made her heart ache. He didn't just cast aside a serviceable stone. He threw away a treasure he was too blind to see. And I was the one lucky enough to find it. And then, for the first time, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not the dutiful kiss of the marriage bed. It was a kiss of searing intensity, of pent-up emotion, of desperation and discovery. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely years and a shared future of two broken pieces finally fitting together. In the heart of the cold stone fortress, something had finally truly begun to thaw. The weeks following Ashworth's disastrous visit were a revelation. It was as if a dam had broken within Alistair. The formal distance that had defined their marriage dissolved, replaced by a tentative, then burgeoning intimacy. They no longer sat at opposite ends of the dining table. They sat together. He sought her out, not just for her mind, but for her company. They walked the moors, rode out to inspect the tenant farms, and spent long evenings in the library, reading in companionable silence before the fire. He talked. He told her about his lonely driven years after his parents' death, the crushing weight of their debts, and the all-consuming fire of his ambition to restore the Beaumont name. He spoke of the vipers in London who had circled waiting for him to fail. He had trusted no one, relied on no one, until her. They all wanted something from me, he explained one night, his hand covering hers as they sat on a sofa. My title, my money, my influence. You were the first person who asked for nothing but respect. You negotiated for your own terms, for your own dignity. Eleanor, in turn, opened up to him. She spoke of her quiet, bookish childhood, her love for her father, and the deep, stinging hurt of being constantly overlooked in favor of flashier, prettier girls. She confessed her fears that she would never be a grand enough duchess for him. You are more than enough, he said, his voice fierce. You are more than they deserve. Their nights changed as well. The dutiful transactions became acts of passion and discovery. He was a tender, considerate lover, as if all the emotion he kept locked away during the day was finally allowed its freedom in the sanctuary of their bedroom. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt not just respected, but desired, cherished. Their peaceful idyll, however, was the calm before the final storm. A letter arrived from her father, frantic with worry. Lord Ashworth, humiliated and furious, had not been idle. Unable to attack the Duke directly, he had returned to his original target, the Vances. He had used his remaining influence to call in several of Baron Vance's oldest, most obscure debts, threatening him with debtor's prison. It was a petty, spiteful act of a cornered rat. "He is trying to wound me through you," Alistair said, his face grim as he read the letter. "He thinks he can use your father as leverage." "We must go to London," Eleanor insisted, her heart aching for her father. "We must face him." "We will," Alistair agreed, "but not just to pay off your father's debts. It is time to finish this. The final piece of my plan is ready." "What final piece?" she asked, a sense of dread mingling with her curiosity. His eyes glinted with the cold, calculating light she hadn't seen in weeks. "For years I have been acquiring the debts and financial dependencies of my enemies, quietly, through third parties. While Ashworth was playing cards and seducing debutantes, I was buying the paper on every loan he held, every bad investment his cronies made. Sir Gideon Croft, Lord Ashworth, nearly half a dozen of the men whose families stood by and watched my father's ruin, are now unknowingly in my pocket." He paused. "And tomorrow the Bank of England is set to make an announcement about a new charter for trade routes to the Americas, an announcement that will make the shares in my new Beaumont Shipping Consortium skyrocket in value and render the shares in their primary rival, the old Associated Traders Guild, virtually worthless." Eleanor stared at him. "And Lord Ashworth and his friends are heavily invested in the Associated Traders Guild." It wasn't a question. "To the hilt," Alistair confirmed with a grim smile. "By tomorrow evening they will be utterly ruined, and I will be the one holding all their markers. Ashworth won't be threatening your father with debtor's prison. He'll be begging me to save him from it himself." The sheer scale of his strategy was breathtaking. This wasn't just revenge, it was a masterful, sweeping financial conquest that had been years in the making. Marrying her had been the psychological blow, the opening salvo. This was the checkmate. They returned to London, arriving at Beaumont House. The city felt different now. Eleanor was no longer the pitied wallflower, but the powerful Duchess of Blackwood, arriving on the arm of her husband. The whispers that followed her now were not of ridicule, but of awe and envy. The news of the bank's announcement broke like a tidal wave over the city's financial district. The Associated Traders Guild collapsed. Fortunes were wiped out in a single afternoon. Panic gripped the clubs and drawing rooms of the elite. That evening, the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood were to attend a grand ball hosted by the Marquess of Salisbury. Everyone who was anyone would be there. It was to be the stage for Alistair's final triumph. As Eleanor dressed, Alistair came into her room. He held a velvet box in his hands. "I had this made for you," he said. She opened it. Lying on a bed of satin was a necklace of staggering beauty. It was a cascade of brilliant ice-white diamonds, with a single magnificent sapphire at its center, the color of a twilight sky. "Alistair, it's too much," she breathed. "Nonsense," he said, his voice soft as he lifted it from the box. He fastened it around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. "Do you remember what I said at our first meeting? That Ashworth was a fool for seeking a diamond?" She nodded, looking at their reflection in the mirror. "I was wrong," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "I have found my diamond, one with the strength and brilliance of a star, and a heart of pure steel." He looked at her reflection, his eyes full of a love that was now unmistakable. Tonight you will not just be the Duchess of Blackwood, you will be the Queen of London." And they will all bow down. The ballroom at Salisbury House fell silent as the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood were announced. They were a portrait of untouchable power, Alistair severe and imposing, Eleanor a vision in sapphire velvet, the Beaumont diamonds at her throat glittering like captured stars. The air, already thick with financial panic, now crackled with the tension of their arrival. Across the room they saw him. Lord Richard Ashworth stood beside a pale Beatrice Croft, his handsome face haggard with ruin. The arrogance had been stripped from him, leaving only raw desperation. He saw them, and like a moth to a flame, he lurched forward, unable to stop himself. "Beaumont!" He snarled, his voice a low hiss that drew the attention of everyone nearby. "This was you. You planned this. You've destroyed me." Alistair regarded him with glacial calm. "Your own greed destroyed you, Ashworth. You simply backed the wrong horse." Beatrice, her face twisted with venom, turned on Eleanor. "And you," she spat, "the little brown mouse. Do you truly think he loves you? You are nothing but a pawn in his game, a tool to humiliate Richard." Before Alistair could intervene, Eleanor raised a hand, her gaze cool and steady. "On the contrary, Lady Croft," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the hushed room. "You and Lord Ashworth see the world in surfaces, in pretty faces, and easy fortunes. The Duke, a man of substance, understands true worth." She took a deliberate step forward, the diamonds flashing. Lord Ashworth looked at me and saw what he thought was a simple stone, and so he threw me away. The Duke looked at me and saw an asset worth investing in. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "I believe his portfolio has performed rather better than yours." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Eleanor then fixed her gaze on Richard. "You threatened my father, a petty, desperate act. Let me assure you Baron Vance is quite secure. As for your own debts," she said with a final dismissive glance, "I believe they are now the property of my husband. I do hope you find him to be a lenient creditor." With that, she turned her back on their stunned, broken faces, took Alistair's arm and walked away. The public execution was complete, and the ton had witnessed every devastating second. Later that night, in the quiet of their London residence, Alistair pulled her into his arms, framing her face with his hands. The pawn became the queen. He murmured, his eyes alight with a love and pride that overwhelmed her. "Tonight, Eleanor, you were magnificent." "I simply learned the rules of the game," she whispered, her heart full. "And I had the best possible partner." He lowered his head and kissed her a kiss not of victory, but of a shared future. The revenge was over. The ghosts of the past were vanquished. The ruthless Duke had won his war, but his greatest prize was not the ruin of his enemies, but the love of the remarkable woman in his arms. And so the story of Lady Eleanor Vance, the woman they laughed at, comes to a close. But it wasn't an ending. It was a magnificent beginning. She proved that true worth isn't found in a pretty face or a hefty dowry, but in the unshakable strength of one's character. Her journey from public humiliation to becoming the respected and beloved Duchess of Blackwood reminds us that the greatest victories are not just about proving others wrong, but about proving to yourself that you are more than they could ever see. Alistair and Eleanor, two lonely souls bound by a contract found in each other, a love forged not in the ballrooms of London, but in the fires of adversity and the quiet halls of mutual respect. Theirs is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most unexpected bargains lead to the most priceless treasures. If you were captivated by Eleanor's journey from outcast to queen, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who loves a tale of triumph and romance, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic, passionate world of history. Thank you for listening.